Welcome to our channel, where real-life stories are brought to life with drama, emotion, and meaningful depth. If you enjoy everyday situations filled with unexpected twists and turns that no one sees coming, then you've come to the right place. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that will make you say, "It feels like a movie, but it's real life." And now, let's dive into today's story. The plane was still stationary on the runway, but tension was already simmering in the first-class cabin. Jack Morgan had just settled into his plush 2A seat, barely reaching for his glass of water, when a sharp, irritated huff echoed from behind him, followed by the sharp clack of high heels pounding down the aisle like a debt collector with a deadline. A shadow loomed over his shoulder. Without even turning around, Jack knew trouble had arrived. "Excuse me, I think you're in my seat," came a voice, cold as steel and sharp as the stare that accompanied it. Standing there was a woman in her 50s, her platinum blonde hair frozen stiff with enough hairspray to survive a hurricane. Her eyes, narrowed in disdain, looked at Jack as if he had just stolen her crown. Calmly, Jack offered a polite smile and held up his ticket. "I believe this is my seat." She curled her lip. "No, sweetie, I think you're mistaken." Unfazed, Jack turned a page of his magazine, showing no interest in arguing. The air around them grew dense with tension. The woman, whose name he would later learn was Karen, scanned the cabin as if searching for an audience for the performance she was about to deliver. Then, with a dramatic sigh loaded with indignation, she barked, "Flight attendant, we have a situation here." Heads began to turn. A few passengers raised their eyebrows. Others smirked knowingly. It was the kind of scene they'd seen before, a woman so entitled she believed the world revolved around her, about to put on a sky-high drama titled "Taking Back What's Rightfully Mine." And center stage, Jack, who had absolutely no intention of giving up his seat. A young flight attendant approached, her face composed with professionalism, though her eyes betrayed the weariness of someone who had seen this kind of drama too many times. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" she asked in a calm, practiced tone, as if fully braced for the storm about to hit. Karen didn't miss a beat. "This man is in the wrong seat. I booked 2A. I always fly first class, and I know this was my assigned seat," she declared, as if announcing her birthright to a throne. Jack said nothing, simply handed over his ticket. The attendant took both tickets, scanned them briefly, then returned Jack's with a nod. "Sir, your seat is correct. Ma'am," she turned to Karen. "Your ticket says 12B, in economy." Karen blinked. A short pause followed, then came a laugh. Not a joyful one, but forced, mocking, dripping with disbelief, as if the entire world had just played a ridiculous joke on her. No, there must be some mistake. I always fly first class. Check again." The attendant's tone remained polite, but her gaze had cooled. "I assure you the information is accurate." Karen's arrogance quickly gave way to irritation. Her voice climbed several octaves. "This is absurd. Do you even know who my husband is? He's a VIP with this airline. I practically live in first class." Jack leaned against the armrest, relaxing like he was watching a live play unfold. Karen turned her fiery glare on him. "You don't understand. I need this seat. For my health, for my blood pressure. My doctor insists I sit in first class." The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Jack tilted his head slightly, voice as soft as a breeze. "Then your doctor should have booked you a first-class ticket." A few passengers stifled chuckles. Karen stared at Jack in disbelief, as if shocked that he dared speak to her that way. But the truth was clear, and for the first time, she could feel the tide beginning to turn against her. Realizing she could sway neither the flight attendant nor Jack, Karen launched into full dramatic mode. Clutching her chest, she began breathing heavily as if experiencing a sudden attack, then staggered slightly, enough to make a nearby passenger recoil in surprise. I have a heart condition," she gasped. "I can't sit in economy. It's too cramped, too suffocating. I need space. I need this seat to breathe." The flight attendant furrowed her brow, maintaining her composure. "Ma'am, if you have a medical condition requiring special accommodation, that information must be provided in advance so we can make arrangements. There's no record of that on your reservation." Karen immediately changed tactics. Fake tears began to stream down her cheeks in the most unconvincing fashion. "Are you accusing me of lying? Are you seriously questioning my health?" The attendant didn't take the bait. Calmly, she replied, "I'm simply following airline policy." The mood in the cabin shifted from tense to nearly comedic. A middle-aged man in the row ahead discreetly pulled out his phone and began recording. Quiet chuckles rippled through the seats like small waves, and it became clear to Karen that control of the situation was slipping from her grasp. But rather than retreat, she doubled down on her performance. Pointing an accusatory finger at Jack, she barked, "You! You don't belong in first class. Just look at you. Did you even pay for that seat? Maybe someone upgraded you as a favor. Don't you think it would be more reasonable to give it to someone who deserves it?" Jack regarded her as one might observe a rare bird making a fool of itself in captivity. He didn't reply right away, letting the silence hang in the air like a dare. Then, cool and even, he said, "I think the person who deserves this seat is the one who booked it properly." His words sliced through the scene like a blade, tearing apart the last threads of Karen's illusion. Her eyes widened. Her mouth opened as if to respond, but no sound came out. Under the weight of the watching cabin, Karen was no longer the entitled queen she imagined herself to be, but a person flailing in the very mess she'd created. Amid the chaos Karen was so desperately trying to create, Jack remained seated, calm, composed, leaning back in his seat as if watching a commercial he could easily skip. Not a wrinkle of concern lined his forehead, no defensive words, no emotional outburst. He didn't need to raise his voice. His stillness was the sharpest counterattack. Karen, realizing Jack's silence wasn't weakness, but rather refusal to engage, began to unravel. She leaned in, her face inches from his, eyes blazing, voice rising to a near scream. "I'm giving you a chance to do the right thing. A civilized person would offer their seat to someone who needs it more." Jack calmly folded his magazine, placed it on the tray in front of him, and looked her straight in the eye. Not with anger, not with disdain, just a steady gaze that froze the air around them. "And I'm giving you a chance to return to your assigned seat before you're removed from this flight." There was no threat in his tone, yet the weight of those words hit like a hammer. A few passengers raised their eyebrows. A woman across the aisle gave a subtle nod of approval. To them, Jack wasn't just defending his seat. He was restoring order at 30,000 feet. Karen stood stunned. The audacity that had served her so well in other situations now crashed against an immovable wall, Jack's unwavering composure. Her lips trembled. She searched for a rebuttal, some way to turn the tide, but Jack had left no openings. The head flight attendant approached, her expression far sterner than before. "Ma'am, if you continue to disrupt the flight, we will have to ask you to deboard." Jack didn't say another word. He leaned back in his seat and pulled a pair of earbuds from his jacket pocket, signaling without saying it. This confrontation was over, at least for him. He didn't need to win the argument. He had already won by refusing to back down. Just as the tension reached a boiling point and a full-blown confrontation seemed inevitable, a calm, authoritative voice rose from a few rows back, like a thunderclap slicing through a tightly shut sky. "I'd love to hear more about how you always fly first class." The voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of someone who was used to being listened to, and instantly, the entire cabin fell silent. Karen froze, as if someone had pulled her emergency brake. Her body stiffened. Slowly, she turned to face the man who had spoken. He was a distinguished-looking gentleman, salt and pepper hair neatly trimmed, a perfectly pressed gray suit without a wrinkle, and a gleaming watch on his wrist. Every detail radiated unspoken authority. Karen blinked. A forced smile appeared on her now pale face. "Oh, you must be one of my husband's colleagues, right?" Her tone softened awkwardly, trying to sound pleasant, as if she hadn't just been screaming at the flight attendant moments before. The man didn't smile. He didn't rush to confirm anything. He simply tilted his head slightly and responded with a line that made the entire cabin hold its breath. "You could say that." "I'm his superior. Anyone holding a drink likely spilled it." Karen stood frozen, her eyes darting between shock and panic. She gave a nervous laugh and muttered, "Oh, I didn't recognize you. You must be new?" The man calmly crossed his arms, one leg resting over the other, studying her like a curious exhibit. "Number, I've been the CEO of this airline for the past 8 years. I think you might be the new one in first class." A soft laugh rippled from somewhere in the back. Karen's face flushed, not with anger, but with humiliation, slowly eating away at her inflated sense of importance. Each word from the CEO cut through the facade she had carefully constructed. In that moment, the balance of power shifted completely. No one was intimidated by her anymore. No one believed the VIP persona she had tried to wear like armor. And for the first time since boarding the plane, Karen realized she was no longer center stage. Karen stood frozen, like a wax figure suddenly drenched in a bucket of ice water. Every eye in the cabin was fixed on her, no longer with sympathy, no longer with silent nods of support, just silence. A heavy collective stillness hung in the air of first class, as the entire cabin bore witness to the collapse of a towering illusion. The CEO, Lucas Bennett, didn't need to raise his voice or throw his weight around. He simply raised a hand, signaling the flight attendant to check seat availability. The young attendant, doing her best to keep a straight face, though the corners of her mouth twitched slightly, glanced at her tablet. "Sir, first class is completely full today." Karen swallowed hard, her shoulders visibly shrinking. "That can't be. Someone must be willing to switch with me?" Her voice no longer carried the sharpness it once had. It wavered, lost, small, and stripped of authority. She turned to Lucas one last time, eyes pleading. I can't sit in the back. I'm not used to it." Lucas leaned back slightly, his tone calm but absolute. "You have 2 choices. Return to your assigned seat, 12B, or deplane and wait for the next available flight." His words cut like the final snip of a frayed rope, holding up the last shreds of Karen's pride. She turned slowly toward the flight attendant, her jaw tight, lips trembling as she fought back anger. "Fine. I'll go." No one said a word. Karen turned around and began the slow walk of defeat down the aisle. The click of her high heels against the floor echoed like the tolling of a bell marking failure. Each step chipped away at the wall of arrogance she had constructed since the start of the flight. She was no longer the commanding presence demanding special treatment, only a fading silhouette, retreating in silence and shame. When she finally disappeared behind the curtain separating first class from economy, a passenger in the front row leaned toward another and whispered, "Pretty sure that's the first mid-air demotion I've ever witnessed." Soft laughter rippled through the cabin, breaking the tension that had held everyone hostage. And just like that, the air shifted. First class slowly settled back into the tranquility it was meant for, though now carrying the lingering echo of a scene no one would soon forget. The flight seemed to have returned to peaceful cruising altitude until about 10 minutes later, when a familiar, sharp, and furious voice cut through the calm. "I want to speak to the pilot immediately." Heads turned instinctively in first class, like muscle memory responding to alarm. Jack closed his eyes and sighed. Trouble, it seemed, wasn't finished yet. A flight attendant hurried toward the back of the plane, her face tight with concern. Jack craned his neck, but could only glimpse the back of a seat and the disheveled blonde hair of Karen rising above the economy row. Her voice pierced through the cabin like a siren. "I'm being treated unfairly. This is blatant discrimination. I have a right to be in first class." The attendant kept her voice calm. "Ma'am, the pilot is flying the aircraft. Unless it's an emergency, he cannot leave the cockpit." Karen would not let go. "This is an emergency. I'm being humiliated in front of everyone." A nearby passenger, a man in a gray suit, muttered just loud enough for those around him to hear, "The only emergency here is how annoying she is." Chuckles rippled through the rows like quiet waves. Karen whipped around, eyes blazing. "Who said that? I'll sue all of you." She wasn't done. Pointing at a woman seated by the window, she barked, "You! Couldn't you switch seats with me? If one person gives up their seat, I could be up there where I belong." The woman simply shrugged. "I paid for my seat, ma'am." Karen reeled in disbelief, her eyes scanning the cabin in search of an ally. But no one came to her defense. Quite the opposite. Several passengers were now recording discreetly, others stifling laughter like they were watching a live comedy show they hadn't even bought tickets for. At this point, it wasn't about anger anymore. It was about isolation. Karen, who had boarded the plane like a self-proclaimed queen, now drifted through economy like a ghost, lost and ignored, surrounded by people who saw right through her performance. As Karen's complaints continued to echo throughout the cabin and the collective patience of the passengers hung by a thread, CEO Lucas Bennett calmly rose from his seat. He didn't gesture, didn't announce himself. His mere presence as he stepped into the aisle between the rows created a ripple of energy that thickened the air like static before a storm. The noise died instantly as he approached Karen's row. She stood there, cheeks flushed, hands on her hips, still playing the role of a plaintiff in a courtroom where the entire flight crew was on trial. But when her eyes met Lucas's cold, steady gaze, the bravado crumbled, as if someone had yanked the stage curtain down before she was ready. "You need to sit down and stop disrupting this flight," he said. His voice was low, but carried more weight than all of Karen's shouting combined. "This is your final warning." Karen opened her mouth, about to speak, perhaps to argue, perhaps to beg, but Lucas didn't let her. "I've stood by and watched you insult our crew, intimidate passengers, and misuse your husband's name to demand something that isn't yours. That ends now." "You can't threaten me like this," Karen snapped, her voice trembling. "I'm married to a senior executive. You have no right—" "You're mistaken," Lucas cut in, his eyes narrowing. "I have every right. And if you continue this behavior, I will personally place you on our airline's no-fly list. Permanently." The cabin fell into suffocating silence. For the first time during this entire ordeal, Karen had no words. She stood frozen, like a student called out in front of the whole class for a serious offense. Her eyes darted around, searching for sympathy, only to find silent stares and shaking heads. Lucas didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked back to first class with measured steps, like a general who had just delivered a sentence that no one dared challenge. Karen stood there, stiff as if she'd been turned to stone midair. Her fingers clutched the strap of her designer handbag so tightly that her knuckles turned white and her lips pressed into a thin line as though trying to contain the storm of rage rising in her chest. But this time, no one was listening. No one was responding. The performance, the shouting, the tears, the demands had all become little more than a tired comedy, and the audience, done with the show. After a long, heavy silence, as if even time itself was waiting for her final decision, Karen lowered her head, saying nothing. No one urged her, no one pushed, but the quiet spoke louder than any mocking laughter. With a bitter exhale, she slumped into seat 12B. Not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice left but to accept defeat. Around her, passengers gradually returned to their routines, though many still glanced sideways, not out of curiosity, but to confirm the storm named Karen had truly passed. A flight attendant quietly exhaled in relief, the strain fading behind her professional mask. Back in first class, Jack glanced at Lucas as he passed by. The CEO said nothing at first, only tilted his head and muttered just loud enough for Jack to hear, "She's definitely getting banned." Jack gave a quiet chuckle, a sense of satisfaction rising with every breath. He didn't need a medal, just this peace. The remainder of the flight unfolded in serenity. No more yelling, no more tension gripping the cabin, just the steady hum of the engines, the soft amber glow of overhead lights, and the gentle swirl of champagne in Jack's glass, a well-earned reward for calm defiance. Far behind, Karen sat in silence. Not a word, not a whisper of protest, just a woman who had plummeted from the heights of self-importance into the grounding reality she had created for herself, crushed beneath the weight of her own arrogance, and forced to face a defeat that no one else but herself had authored. The plane touched down with an oddly gentle landing, as if even the sky itself had decided to let go of those who had just endured a battle without bullets. Jack stood up, straightened his jacket, and gathered his carry-on. He didn't rush. There was no need to. The calm after the storm was always more precious than the haste at the beginning of the journey. As he passed through the curtain separating first class from economy, his eyes instinctively drifted towards seat 12B. And there she was, Karen, the woman who had turned the cabin upside down with shouting and entitlement, now sitting small, her face frozen like a statue. She no longer tried to mask her defeat. Her gaze was averted, her posture shriveled. The silence that surrounded her now wasn't restraint. It was resignation. At the baggage claim, Jack spotted her again. She stood off to the side, arms crossed, eyes distant, as if silently weighing whether to preserve what remained of her pride or pretend none of it had ever happened. When their eyes met, she tilted her chin upward, not out of arrogance, but as a feeble attempt to salvage her crumbling dignity. "I hope you're happy about all this," she hissed, as though Jack had been the architect of her downfall. Jack paused for just a moment. Then he smiled, not smug, not sarcastic, just calm. And with a single sentence, he brought the entire spectacle to its quiet, definitive end. "Oh, I most certainly am. Oh, I most certainly am." He turned and walked away, leaving behind a woman who once believed she could control the skies with a few sharp words. Now, all she had was a heavy suitcase, cold stares from strangers, and a well-earned lesson learned at 35,000 feet. As for Jack, he exited the terminal with his head held high, his spirit light, as if he'd settled a debt he never truly owed. And above all, he understood, first class isn't always about where you sit. Sometimes it's about how you carry yourself to get there. The incident on the plane wasn't just a dramatic encounter between an entitled woman and a calm passenger. It was a mirror reflecting everyday situations we often face in life. Situations where power, status, and ego are mistakenly seen as golden tickets, tools to bypass rules, demand privileges, and overshadow others. The first and most obvious lesson here is this: respect isn't earned through status, but through behavior. Karen boarded the plane believing that being the wife of a VIP gave her the right to claim whatever she wanted. But reality proved otherwise. No matter who you are, you're still bound by the same rules as everyone else. No one is above the system just because they think they deserve to be. Second, calmness is one of the sharpest weapons against injustice or conflict. Jack didn't raise his voice, didn't lash out, but it was his steady composure and unwavering clarity that made it impossible for Karen to manipulate the situation. In life, we can't control how others behave, but we can control how we respond. And sometimes, calm confidence earns more respect than the loudest argument ever could. Third, true authority doesn't need to be loud. The airline CEO didn't enter with a spotlight or fanfare, yet the moment he spoke, the entire cabin fell silent. In stark contrast, Karen had been shouting for attention, only to alienate everyone around her. Whether at work, at home, or in the community, real leadership isn't about who speaks the most. It's about who acts wisely, speaks with intention, and earns respect through quiet strength. Lastly, remember this: your attitude is the ticket that determines where you sit in life. Not everyone in economy is small, and not everyone in first class is truly great. It's how you treat others, your humility, and your self-awareness that determine whether people will honor you, whether in a plane or in the greater journey of life. Karen's story ended with her sitting in the seat she was assigned, but the lesson she received may linger far beyond the flight. And maybe, for all of us, the real question isn't where we're sitting. It's whether we truly deserve the seat we're in. If you felt a sense of satisfaction watching someone like Karen finally face the consequences of her own arrogance, then don't forget to hit that like button on this video. Have you ever encountered a Karen in real life? Share your story in the comments. You might have had to stand your ground just like Jack to protect what was rightfully yours. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more intense, emotional stories like this, where justice doesn't have to scream to be heard, and calm courage speaks louder than chaos. And don't forget to share this video with your friends, because sometimes raising your voice doesn't get you what you want. But the right silence just might be the most powerful response of all. We'll see you in the next story. In the disclaimer, this video is created for entertainment purposes and to convey messages about attitude, behavior, and conduct in public settings. While inspired by situations that could happen in real life, the characters, names, and details have been fictionalized to add depth, enhance dramatic effect, and engage viewers. This video is not intended to target or criticize any specific individual or organization. We do not condone discrimination, personal attacks, or hostility of any kind. Instead, we believe that calmness, respect, and personal integrity are the most effective tools for handling challenging situations. All opinions expressed in the video reflect the perspective of the storyteller and do not represent the official views of this channel. Viewers are encouraged to approach the content with an open mind and to receive it as a thoughtful, human-centered story designed to provide both insight and entertainment.